find that it's really hard to ask for help, probably sometime in your childhood, someone told you not to cry for help anymore. Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you haven't been here in a while, welcome back. If it's the first time you've been here, welcome in general. And today's episode, we're talking about the trauma of not being heard and seen. And I really think it's right on time, being that it's June 29th, 2022, and you know what's been going on in the United States. Anyway, I want to say with all of that, I'm here, I'm with you. Recognize that our social media and news right now is being bombarded with so much trauma dumping at this point in time that it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to check out. It's okay to take a walk or get into some nature so that you are not constantly in the news. We know what's going on, and there are things we can do, and there are things we cannot do. So make sure, as a survivor, right at this point in time, that you're doing what you can and kind of dropping the rest and taking care of yourself, okay? Because as we know, all these things are not a sprint, it is a marathon. And with any marathon, you have to take trauma of not being seen and heard. How can we start to heal from the trauma of not being seen and heard? And firstly, what is trauma? You know, because it's really important to have a working definition of what trauma is. Um, the symptoms of trauma, right, are sometimes loss of memory and anxiety and depression, and all these different things can be signs and symptoms of trauma. But what we really want to focus on, especially when we start to talk about recovery, is how can we heal? How can we move forward? What can we do, right? Because oftentimes we tend to get stuck, especially as survivors. We get stuck in that cycle of fight, flight, freeze, depending on the day sometimes. So if you're in that cycle, it's okay because obviously it's normal. It's a normal and necessary response to things that you should not have ever had to deal with, okay? So that's first and foremost. But our working definition is, you know, trauma is anything that is beyond our ability to cope with a situation, a circumstance. But more than that, more than our ability to cope, trauma is not having a safe, supportive place to be seen and to be heard, right? So, not being seen and heard is a part of the definition of what trauma is. It's oftentimes people who experience trauma in childhood or even through ancestral lineage, there is this, there's not always a safe place to go. There's not always this safe place to rest. There's not always safe people. And the first step in healing trauma, any type of trauma, is a safe, supportive person, because we heal in relationship. We heal with other people, whether it's a group or one-on-one or with family. And so people can go through the exact same thing. Hundreds of people can go through a hurricane, and only a very, very small percentage of them will have what is called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, or traumatic or some type of trauma responses, right? Not every single person that goes through something gets trauma. The difference between the people that do have trauma stuck in their bodies, in their minds, in their spirits, and someone who does not, who went through that same thing, they all went through that same hurricane, is the person that has it didn't have a support system. Maybe they didn't have family in other parts of the country to go stay with during that hurricane. If the hurricane wiped out everything you had, and all you had left was family to fall back on, and your family was unsafe, or your family didn't have resources, so now you're on the street, right? And the people who don't, oftentimes they have family, they have resources, they have, a community, they have people that understand. I like to think about like the Vietnam vets. They came back, and there were so many people who were disgusted by them. You go through all these traumatic events and actions placed on you. You were told you had to do these things and carry these things out. And when you get back, you don't even get the support of your community, right? So that's the major difference, is community, safety, security, and coming back into a place of stability and being grounded with the community, right? So yes, healing trauma, it doesn't matter the type of trauma, always in some type of community. You always need safe people, okay? And that's why, if your family isn't safe, if your friends aren't safe, then that's why you start to reach out to these outer layers of, therapy or trauma recovery specialists such as me, and things like that. So there are many, many people that can support and help if you need to be, if you need to reach out. Take a moment, take a breath in, let it out, recognizing that at any point in time, you can take a break. If you like what you hear, if you are wanting to hear more, please click in the description box below and subscribe to the newsletter. The newsletter is your place for trauma journal prompts, okay? You're gonna get all kinds of good stuff, and get first dibs on trauma recovery groups and sessions and all of that good stuff. So please click on the description box below and let's go. Trauma of not being heard. Let's start there. So there's the trauma of not being seen and the trauma of not being heard. A lot of times, if you are not heard, it kind of gets stuck in your throat chakra. So your throat chakra is right around here in your throat, okay? And a lot of times it'll feel tight or scratchy or heavy, or like you have a lump in your throat. And this is two parts. So if your throat chakra is you're feeling something as I'm talking about your throat chakra, and it's getting like louder and louder and louder, chances are you have something stuck in your throat chakra right now. And that works in two ways when we're talking about not being heard. One way is you're not speaking your truth, and you need to step up and step into your authenticity and your truth because it needs to come out. The second way is, you are speaking up. You are speaking out, and the people around you aren't listening. They're not paying attention to anything you have to say. And that is really painful, right? When the people you feel like should be there for you aren't. That can be really painful. So take a moment to recognize that our first and foremost defense against trauma is our immediate circle. The first two people in your mind that you would call, those are the people who are going to support you when you get that first boop of trauma, of something happens and you have all these responses. Those people that will be around you, if you don't have anyone that you would trust if you were really in trouble, that is a really good sign that you probably have the trauma of not being heard. Because you probably listen to people and you probably take on the role of hearing for people, listening to them, responding to them, being really active and getting their stories and being there for them while simultaneously not being there for yourself. So before I go too much further, something that really stood out to me, I heard a TikToker say it, so I don't remember his name. I'm sorry. But if you remember who said this, they said something along the lines of every species is born with exactly what they need to survive. And as humans, we are born, like we come out of the womb, born and ready to cry for help, to ask for help, to say, I need something. Everyone is born with that innate ability, and that innate ability gets your needs met, or it's meant to get your needs met. So that cry for help is the very first thing that happens, right? In a traumatic experience or experience that could be traumatic. The cry for help is the very first thing that happens. And if it isn't happening for you, if you find that it's really hard to ask for help, probably sometime in your childhood, someone told you not to cry for help anymore. Or you kept asking for help, and your needs were never met. Whether emotional, whether physical, whether spiritual. We have spiritual needs. We have an innate spiritual needs, some of us more than others. And if your caregivers or parents weren't particularly spiritual and couldn't support you in that way, then those needs went unmet, even when you asked. If your parents or caregivers were emotionally unavailable, those needs went unmet, even when you asked. And so, absolutely, your cry for help went unheard. Okay? Oftentimes, this is when the unhealthy coping mechanisms start to come in, okay? Because you cried for help. And then your cry gets louder, right? Because you're asking. First, you're using your mouth and your words, potentially, depending on your age. Then maybe you start using your body language. You're slamming doors, right? You know, a teenager, you're slamming doors all the time. And that's a cry for help. That's a need. That's attention. You don't slam a door if you don't want attention, no matter what they say, okay? Those teenagers, they can say one thing, but the body language, okay? And this is where being passive aggressive starts to come in. You have a need. It wasn't met when you asked. Whether that person could not do it or would not do it, right? Doesn't matter. It wasn't met. And so then you find other ways, specifically if you have emotionally unavailable people and spiritually unavailable people who were your caregivers in childhood. You get passive aggressive because you're trying to find a way that's the least offensive to them to get your needs met. And maybe if you're really passive about it, but you're also kind of aggressive, really you're being mean, but not too mean so that you won't get this reaction, right? And so it kind of cycles into this unhealthy inability to ask for help anymore, because when you did, it wasn't heard, it wasn't met. It was either unable, or you should be grateful for what you have now. That's often the response. You should be grateful that I'm even here feeding you in childhood, right? Especially with those emotionally unavailable folks. And so this is oftentimes where We start to use drugs. We start to use alcohol. We start to use relationships. Those are the big three. Okay, those are the big three unhealthy coping mechanisms: drugs, alcohol, relationships. And when I mean relationships, usually I mean either romantic relationships or friendships that are one sided. If you are in one sided relationships, whether romantic or not, you probably have the trauma of not being heard or seen. And oftentimes you start to try and give that person what you need. So for instance, say you really just needed someone to sit down, look at you, acknowledge what you said, and worked to help you understand how you feel and what you really need to do at that point. That's exactly what you start to give to these friendships and these partners. But they often will not give that to you because you're meeting a need for them, and usually you're seeking out people who are unhealthy anyway, and they don't see you, they don't hear you, because now you have this unhealthy fear of asking for help, because when you do, it goes unmet. Right? So it's a vicious cycle. All these things start to cycle through. You see how this can get out of hand really fast. All right? So just take a moment, take another breath, take another break. Take a nice deep breath in, let it out, because stuff starts to come up. When we start to talk about the trauma of not being heard, not being seen, oh, the shit starts to come up. The feelings start to come up. The avoidance starts to come up. The first step in healing is to pause and recognize that it hurts in the first place, okay? When you're unheard, oftentimes you're also unseen. And what I mean by seen is being seen from the heart for who you are, not for what you do. You know, if people are like, or not for what you look like either. You know, if people are always talking about the things that you do for them, I love that you listen to me. I love that I could talk to you. Or what you look like, obviously comments and compliments about your appearance. If that's the only thing that they can really just compliment you on, chances are they probably don't really see you. Now, if somebody's like, you're a really kind person and I'm genuinely enjoying spending time with you, boom, now you've been seen. And oftentimes, when you go unheard, you get really scared to be seen. So, this is way longer than I wanted it to be. And I think we're just gonna have to talk about this more because it goes deep, you know, not being seen, not being heard, it goes deep. The first step to recovery, to trauma recovery, period, is to recognize that you're feeling something. If you listen to this episode and you started feeling, you know, some sadness or some stuff in your chest, in your heart, some stuff in your throat, your heart chakra, your stomach, noticing where you feel those things, it's gonna take you a lot farther than most people ever come when it comes to recovery and discovering who you are on the other side of childhood trauma and ancestral trauma.